In Middle-earth, there's so many names for different groups of men, or sometimes even so many names for the same group of men. Have you ever wondered where these groups came from, or how they were related to each other? Have you ever wondered what their history was, and what made them the way that they are? Never fear, in this video I will guide you through every known group of men in Middle-earth, and explain a little bit about them. Like elves, men all awoke in the same place, a land in the distant east called Hildorian. In that sense, all men are at least distantly related to each other. However, there were very clear differences from the start, not just physically, but also ideologically. Infamously, in the beginning, it's said that all men fell to the worship of Morgoth. However, not long afterwards, a group repented and split from the rest, starting their long journey westwards. These men were the ancestors of the Edain, and from them would come many of the groups of men who inhabited the western regions of Middle-earth. So first, I'll talk about them, and then move on to all other known groups of men whose origins aren't as clearly defined. The ancestors of the Edain quickly split into three groups, and it's these three groups that would arrive in Beleriand to fight against Morgoth, where they would be known as the Edain. The first group were the House of Beor. They had a wide range of physical characteristics, being tall and short, often broader shoulder, with skin and hair tones ranging from fair to dark. They were the most stoic and learned of the Edain, and they spoke a dialect of a language called Taliska. The second group were the House of Halef. They were similar in appearance to the majority of the House of Beor, having dark hair and light eyes, although they were described as shorter. But they were also not closely related to the House of Beor. They spoke an entirely different language which was unrelated to Taliska, and their customs were entirely different. They were also very insular, being aloof to other peoples and always remaining relatively few in number. Interestingly, they were accompanied by an even stranger group of men called the Druedain. I'll talk more about them later. The third and largest group were the House of Hador. They were completely different in physical appearance to the other two houses, being tall, fair-haired, and bright-eyed. Despite the physical differences, they shared a lot in common with the House of Beor. They spoke a similar dialect of Taliska, and they also shared a desire to learn. But unlike the House of Beor, they had a reputation for being temperamental, and were also the most warlike of the three houses. Unfortunately, all three houses of the Edain suffered greatly in the war against Morgoth. The House of Beor were brought to the brink of destruction during the Dagor Bragollach, and their survivors merged with the other two houses. The House of Hador contributed the most in the war, but their army was destroyed at the Neneath Anoediad, and their people were enslaved. The House of Halef retained their freedom for longer, hiding in the depths of Brethil, but they dwindled and almost completely destroyed themselves in a civil war. However, members from all three houses continued fighting against Morgoth, and for that they received their reward. This reward was Numenor, and the survivors of the three houses would become the Numenoreans. They were blessed both physically and spiritually, living for between 200 to 400 years, standing often at 7 feet tall, being immune to most sickness, and having the ability to relinquish their lives whenever they wished. Most of the Numenoreans descended from the House of Hador, and were thus golden-haired, but a minority were descended from the House of Beor, and they had dark hair. Presumably, some Numenorians were also descended from the House of Halef, but their language died out, and the language of Numenor became Adunaic, very similar to the Taliska that both the Beorians and the Hadorians had spoke. Numenor would go on to become the greatest civilization of men that the world had ever seen. Their works and crafts were only surpassed by the greatest of the elves and dwarves, their power became unmatched as the Second Age progressed, and their wealth and splendour was unrivaled. As the years went on, Numenor began to take a greater interest in Middle-earth, and the Numenorians began to create settlements and fortresses along the coast. Unfortunately, as Numenor's power grew, so did the shadow lengthen on Numenor, and after Sauron finished corrupting the Numenorians at the end of the Second Age, they destroyed themselves by attacking Valinor. Not all Numenorians met their end, and two new groups would exist into the Third Age. The most important of these groups were the Dunedain. These were the faithful Numenorians who had dwelt in the northern lands and would found Arnor and Gondor. The Dunedain were mostly descended from the House of Beor, so they usually had dark hair. However, on account of being in Middle-earth, their physical and spiritual advantages began to fade, and although they were still taller than the average man, their lifespans were longer, and their arts and crafts far outmatched them. Most of the Dunedain, with the exception of those in Dol Amroth, abandoned Adunaic and instead using Westron, a Volgar descendant of Adunaic, or Sindarin. For some, Quenya was still a language of law. The other group of Numenorians that survived the downfall were the Black Numenorians. They were the King's Men Numenorians who dwelt in the south of Middle-earth and would found rival realms such as Umbar. Unlike the Faithful, they were mostly descended from the House of Hador, so one might expect most of them to have golden hair. They suffered the same decline the Dunedain experienced, although at a faster rate, owing to their spiritual corruption and then mixing with lesser men after they were overthrown from power. Presumably, they continued to use Adunaic, at least until the language was either extinguished or merged with the languages of the Haradrim. In the beginning, I mentioned that the ancestors of the Edain went westwards, but not all of these men made it to Beleriand. In fact, only a minority did. Many of them settled the wide, mostly empty lands between the Sea of Rhûn in the east and the Blue Mountains in the west, and in these lands they managed to avoid most of the suffering the Edain experienced. Many of these men developed a distinct culture and sometimes a distinct language, although some remained similar enough to the Edain that they could be recognized as kin many years later. Perhaps the most important group to emerge was the Northmen. These men were believed to have been descended from the ancestors of the House of Hador. After all, they were similar in temperament, and both were tall, with fair hair and bright eyes. These men mostly settled in the lands between the Sea of Rhûn and the Misty Mountains, and there's some evidence that suggests that they might have moved as far south as Gondor. In the First and Second Age, these men developed a close relationship with the dwarves, and both groups would prosper thanks to this alliance. Unfortunately, the Northmen were brought to their knees following the War of the Elves and Sauron. They did gradually recover and began to develop distinct identities. Those who dwelt in Mirkwood or in the neighbouring Vales of Anduin were often called woodmen. They were decentralised, living in smaller communities or homesteads, and their fortunes often depended on the activeness of evil at any one given time. They suffered greatly during repeated Easterling invasions, for example. In the late Third Age, the woodmen of the Vales of Anduin would often be called the Beornings, on account of the skin changer Beorn and his descendants, who united them and kept the lands safe in the time of the War of the Ring. The most powerful group that emerged were the Northmen of Rhovanion, who dwelt between Mirkwood and the Sea of Rhûn. They were a confederation of princes who were then united as Gondor's ally in the middle of the Third Age. They provided Gondor with a powerful cavalry force, and many of them would end up taking service in Gondor's army, and even ended up dwelling there. Unfortunately, they were devastated by the Great Plague and were then either enslaved or driven away during the Wainwrighter Easterling invasion of 1856. Although the Wainwriters were eventually defeated, the Northman Kingdom of Rhovanion never returned, and although some Northmen continued to dwell in those lands, they were then finished off by the Balkoff Easterlings in the late 25th century. But Rhovanion's biggest legacy came from those who fled. These gathered in the Middle Vales of Anduin, and they would become known as the Aethiod. While they originally tried to free their old homeland, eventually they migrated further north to the Upper Vales of Anduin, where they would prosper and grow numerous for the next 5 centuries. Led by Ael the Young, they would then ride to Gondor's aid during the Balkoff invasion, and after saving Gondor's army and winning the battle, they were granted the region of Calenadon. Calenadon would go on to be known as Rockand and later Rohan. The Aethiod would come to be known as the Rohirrim, Gondor's most reliable ally. In the late Third Age, yet another Northman group rose to power in the north of Middle-earth. These would later be known as the Men of Dale, or the Bardings. They had dwelt in the lands between the Celduin and the Carnan throughout the entirety of the Third Age, but had played little part in the events of Middle-earth. But, thanks to the arrival of the dwarves to the Lonely Mountain, they had grown rich and prosperous, founding the city of Dale beneath the foot of the mountain, and other towns such as Esgaroth, which was built upon the Long Lake. Although the arrival of Smaug would ruin Dale, the later death of the dragon at the hands of Bard the Bowman would lead to a unification of the Northmen in the region, with Bard becoming the first king of Dale. Along with the dwarves, these Northmen would provide a bulwark in the north of Middle-earth against Sauron's forces in Rhûn. But not all of the native men of the Westlands were related to the House of Hador. In the north of Eriador, between the Brandywine and the Horwell, there were a group of men related to the House of Beor. These men were simply called the Men of Eriador. They were the first men the Numenorians encountered when they returned to Middle-earth. It was a good meeting, as Adunaic was still close enough to Beorian Taliska for the two groups to understand each other reasonably well. Apart from that, not much is known about the Men of Eriador. They, like many other groups, suffered greatly during the War of the Elves and Sauron. Afterwards, they would merge with the faithful Numenorian settlers who would eventually found the Kingdom of Arnor. Late in the Third Age, the Men of Eriador still exist in the form of the Men of Bree, who are also descended from the House of Halef. Speaking of the House of Halef, a large number of the native men in the Westlands were related to them. These groups spread from Gondor and the River Anduin in the east to the lands of Enedwaith and Minhiriath in the west. They ranged from short and broad to tall in stature, and they were darker skinned than both the Northmen and the Men of Eriador. These men were the most primitive of those that had not reached Beleriand, and this, combined with the fact that the Haladin spoke an entirely unrelated language, meant that contact between the Numenorians and these men often led to violence. While later Gondorian historians recognized the kinship and would label these men as Pre-Numenorians, at the time they were given different names and were regarded as Men of Shadow. For example, the men who lived in Enedwaith and Minhiriath were called the Gwatherim, the Shadow People. They were called this because they began attacking the Numenorians who were rapidly deforesting their native lands. When Sauron arrived during the War of the Elves and Sauron, the Gwatherim initially welcomed him as a liberator, but this changed when Sauron set fire to the remnants of their forests. The remaining Gwatherim then retreated to the corners of their lands. Some took refuge in the woods of Erin Vorn, a remnant of the great forests that dominated the region. Others took refuge along the coast, where they would remain even until the Fourth Age, described by Gandalf as a numerous yet barbarous fisherfolk. Some fled north, where they would be integrated into Arnor, and like the Men of Eriador, their descendants would survive in the form of the Breelanders. But perhaps the most important group took refuge in the hills and plains on the western side of the Misty Mountains. This land was called Dunland, and these men would come to be known as the Dunlendings. They were nominally subjects of Gondor for much of the Third Age, and although they had little contact with other men, they weren't outright hostile, having had both dwarves and hobbits as neighbours. Their biggest feud was with the Rohirrim. When Gondor retreated, the Dunlendings had begun settling in Calenadon, but when Calenadon was gifted to Rohan, the Rohirrim saw the Dunlendings as illegal squatters. For generations, the two sides warred with each other, leading to the Dunlendings happily siding with Saruman during the War of the Ring. However, there was also a degree of mixing between the two sides, which occurred mainly in the region known as the Westmarch. Other pre-Numenorian groups also had mixed fortunes. During the Second Age, Sauron managed to convert many of the pre-Numenorians who dwelt both north and south of the White Mountains to Morgoth worship. Some didn't really understand, and clearly did so out of fear, whereas others were more fervent in their beliefs. One such group was the Men of the Mountains, who lived in the valleys of the White Mountains near Erech. They were a powerful force, and at the end of the Second Age, they swore an oath to Isildur that they would fight against Sauron should he return. They later broke this oath, and ended up becoming the Oathbreakers, the undead who were cursed to dwell in the infamous paths of the dead until they were eventually freed from their oath. Those pre-Numenorians who did not end up siding with Sauron ended up dwelling in the lands that would become Gondor. Over the course of the Third Age, these men, who mostly dwelled in Gondor's inland provinces, were gradually integrated into Gondor. These included groups such as the Axemen of Lossarnach, who were noticeably shorter, broader, and darker than the Dunedain Gondorians, and the less well-described hillmen who lived in the region of Lamadon. Although their ancestors may have once served the Shadow, by the end of the Third Age, these men were fiercely loyal to Gondor. Alright, that's our men who were related or descended from the three houses of the Edain, but there were plenty of other men out there. Let's start with the main groups who were commonly referred to as Men of Shadow, thanks to their service to the Dark Lords. The first such group that was encountered in history was the Easterlings of the First Age, most of whom belonged to either the House of Bor or the House of Ulfang. These men were shorter and broader than the Edain, with dark hair and either swarthy or sallow skin. Unfortunately, most of the Easterlings of the First Age remained in service to the Dark. The Easterlings of Ulfang, while feigning fealty to the Noldor, betrayed them during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears and sided with Morgoth. They were promised Beleriand as a reward, but were instead kept inside Hithlum. Despite this, they fought for Morgoth again during the War of Wrath, and once defeated, they fled far away into the east. But to be fair, the Easterlings of Bor did remain faithful and fought to the bitter end. The fate of these Easterlings is unknown. They may have been destroyed, but we know some of their kinsmen lived in the north of Eriador, where they were described as tillers of the earth. They may have merged with the Men of Eriador, or might have become groups which I'll talk about shortly. The Easterlings of the First Age were not related to the Easterlings that followed, although realistically, as Easterling is a broad term for any man from the East, there's no proof any of these groups were related except for a few exceptions. In saying that, the perception of the Easterlings from the men of the West remained the same throughout the ages, that they were wild and warlike. Easterlings poured into the Westlands following the War of the Elves and Sauron, even reaching as far as the Anduin, usually at the expense of the Northmen. But following Sauron's defeat at the end of the Second Age, the Northmen again became dominant in these lands. During the Third Age, several different groups appeared. There were the Easterlings who attacked Gondor in the 5th century, and then those that attacked again in the 13th century. Perhaps the most infamous Easterlings were the Wain Riders who attacked in the 19th century. They were a semi-nomadic, martial people who travelled in chariots and wagons. After the Wain Riders were defeated, their descendants re-emerged again in the form of the Balkoff in the 25th century. Even during the War of the Ring, Easterlings were being encountered that had never been seen before by the Gondorians, such as the bearded axemen who fought at the Pelennor fields. Speaking of the Pelennor, the Easterlings were amongst Sauron's most elite forces, and had the most success during the War of the Ring, being the most difficult to defeat at several battles, and even scoring a victory over the Dwarves and the Dale men at the Battle of Dale. To the south, there was another large group of men known as Southrons or Haradrim. Like the Easterlings, the Haradrim were made up of many different groups and kingdoms. Those who dwelt in the lands closest to Gondor were described as being tall, with dark skin and dark eyes. They adorned themselves in gold and scarlet, and were also described as warlike and cruel, although diplomacy between them and places like Gondor did occur from time to time. From Far Harad, another group of men are described. They are called Trollmen and were completely alien to the men of Rohan who faced them on the Pelennor fields. They had black skin, white eyes, and red tongues. The Haradrim also engaged in a degree of mixing over the millennia. First, Numenorean colonists ended up settling along the coastlines of the south, and some of these, especially the Black Numenorians, ended up mingling with the native men. In the Third Age, Gondor conquered Umbar and a large portion of Near Harad, and once again, a degree of mingling ended up happening, especially later on when Castamir's descendants set up a realm in Umbar that was in opposition to Gondor. Thus, the later Corsairs of Umbar who played Gondor's coasts were likely of both Numenorean and Haradrim descent. Like the Easterlings, the Haradrim and their Corsair kinsmen made up a significant number of Sauron's forces during the War of the Ring. Their biggest contributions were in the invasion of southern Gondor and at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. There is another group from the eastern lands that are described separately from both the Haradrim and the Easterlings. These are the Variags, a group of men from Khand, which was south and east of Mordor. We know almost nothing about the Variags of Khand. At times, they fought with both the Easterlings and the Haradrim, but also allied with them. They also served Sauron and could be found at the Battle of Pelennor Fields alongside plenty of other groups of men. There's a few other groups of men in or near to the Westlands who are a bit of a mystery. One such group is the Lossoth. They were men who dwelt around the Ice Bay of Thorkel in the north of Middle-earth, a cold, unforgiving environment. They are never physically described, but we get insights into their lifestyle. They were semi-nomadic, they built ice houses, igloos, and they used sleighs and skates made of bone to move around quickly. They were extremely aloof to outsiders, but were not hostile. They aided King Arvedui of Arthedain when he fled north from the Witch King's forces, and as for the Witch King himself, they had no love for him, and were afraid he could control the weather. They had a large degree of knowledge and foresight about their environment. They warned Arvedui not to board his rescue ship as a storm was coming. Sure enough, the storm came, and Arvedui was killed when the ship was destroyed. We don't know the origin of the Lossoth, except that they were a remnant of an ancient people who dwelt in the frozen north of Middle-earth known as the Forodwaith. Yes, the people and place shared the same name. When the Forodwaith existed exactly beyond the First Age, and what happened to them is unknown, except that they seem to be gone by the end of the Third Age. We also don't know what encouraged them to settle in the inhospitable north, Morgoth's old domain. Truly, they are one of Middle-earth's mysteries, and that's why my first ever video in that series was on them. Two other groups that existed in the north, specifically in Eriador, were the men of Angmar and the hillmen of Rhudaur. We know very little about both groups. The hillmen of Rhudaur were originally subjects of Arnor, but relations seem to have been poor, and they ended up overthrowing the Dunedain of Rhudaur and siding with the Witch King of Angmar. As for the men of Angmar, described only once as the men of Khârn Dûm, they were never subjects of Arnor, and were described as an evil folk who later dabbled in dark sorcery. Both groups were annihilated following Angmar's destruction in 1975 of the Third Age. Like the Lossoth, we don't know exactly where these men came from or who they were related to, and whether they were related to each other. There's a good case to be made that the hillmen of Rhudaur were related to the Haladin. After all, they did share similarities with the Dunlendings who lived to the south. However, it's also possible that both groups were descended from the Easterlings of the First Age. We're told that some of the Easterlings of Bor farmed lands in the north of Eriador. We're unsure what happened to them, but given the animosity between the Edain and the Easterlings, it's possible they were forced to the fringes of Eriador, and because of that, later became hostile to the Dunedain. There's also the mystery of who lived in Dorwinion, a land on the edge of the Sea of Rhûn. It may have been elves, men, or even both. If there were men there, we aren't sure of what group they belonged to. They could have been Northmen, given they were seemingly friendly with the peoples to the west, or they could have been Easterlings, as those were the closest men in proximity. They could have also been a mix of both groups, with even some possible Dunedain influence, given that Gondor's borders once extended to the Sea of Rhûn. Whoever they were, given they were renowned for wine, they were probably a fairly knowledgeable people with more interest in culture and trade rather than warfare. Finally, let's get to perhaps the two strangest group of men. The first one is one I've already mentioned, the Druedain. As I said before, the Druedain actually came to Beleriand with the House of Haleth, but the two groups were obviously not related. The Druedain don't look like any other men. They're short and stooped, they have red eyes and thin dark hair, and they had a shorter lifespan than other men. They did not make settlements like other men, instead living in caves and forests, but despite this, they were not savages. They had strict codes, were extremely knowledgeable about nature, and were capable of strange magic such as animating statues. The Druedain had an interesting history too. They lived in Brethil with the House of Haleth, but were always few in number, and by the end of the First Age, they had dwindled to just a few families, who later sailed to Numenor with the rest of the Edain. But the Druedain only stayed in Numenor for a few centuries, correctly predicting that dark days would come to the island, so they sailed back to Middle-earth. There, the Druedain, perhaps on account of their appearance or strange ways, were often hunted and were driven from their lands by other men, usually the Pre-Numenorians who also feared them. By the end of the Third Age, they were reduced to living in just two places, the Druedain forest in Gondor, and the wild land of, forgive my pronunciation, Druedain to the west of Gondor. The Druedain still played an important role in the War of the Ring. When King Theoden and the Rohirrim rode to the aid of Minas Tirith, they found a large army blocking their road, but the Druedain of the Druedain forest intervened and led the Rohirrim down a secret path that allowed them to bypass the enemy and reach Minas Tirith in time. Even in the west, the Druedain of Druedain were said to have destroyed the remnants of Saruman's orcs who had fled the destruction of Isengard. Our last group sometimes aren't even considered to be men, but they are, and that group is the Hobbits. We don't know where the Hobbits came from, or really any of their early history, except that it was described as savage. They first appear in the history books early in the Third Age, dwelling in the lands of Rhovanion. At this point, they were split into three major groups, the Fallowhides, the Harfoots, and the Stores. While there were some differences, all Hobbits shared the same identifiable traits. They were short, even shorter than dwarves, and they had furry feet with leathery soles that meant that they didn't need to wear shoes. They also lived slightly longer than regular men. Many reached 100, and some could live as long as 130. That said, the three groups also had some slight differences. The Stores grew facial hair and enjoyed boats, fishing, and nature. The Fallowhides were the fairest, tallest, and slimmest of the three groups. They were also more adventurous and were open to outsiders. The largest group were the Harfoots, and from them came the tradition of living in burrows or hobbit holes. Following 1000 of the Third Age, the three groups migrated across the Misty Mountains, and while some Stores would migrate back across for a time, by the 17th century, most hobbits in Middle-earth could be found living in the Shire. Those that lived beyond the Misty Mountains and the Vales of Anduin had disappeared by the time of the War of the Ring. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want more broader explanations or even videos that are more focused on the topic and peoples I just mentioned, please let me know. You guys have genuinely provided me with some fantastic ideas in the past, so keep at it. Cheers, farewell, and remember, I don't have anything written down here, so I'm just gonna end the video like this.